In the late 19th century, a storm was sweeping across Africa. European powers, armed with industrial might and a sense of absolute superiority, were carving up the continent in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. From 1881 to 1914, nation after nation fell under colonial rule. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, they all claimed their piece of the vast African territory. By the end of this period, a map of Africa looked like a patchwork quilt of European empires. Yet, amidst this relentless conquest, two nations held firm: Liberia, a state founded by freed American slaves, and a far more ancient kingdom in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia. This is the story of how one nation stood against the tide of history and delivered a blow to European colonialism that would echo for generations. The year is 1896. Italy, a newly unified nation eager to forge its own empire and claim its place in the sun, set its sights on Ethiopia. Italian leaders, fueled by the prevailing racist belief that Africans were disorganized and technologically backward, expected a swift and effortless conquest. They saw Ethiopia as little more than a stepping stone to imperial glory. But what they failed to understand was that they weren't invading a scattered collection of tribes. They were challenging a civilization forged over millennia. Ethiopia was no fledgling state. It was an ancient kingdom with a history stretching back over 2,000 years, a direct inheritor of the powerful Aksumite Empire. It possessed a unique cultural identity, complete with its own written script, Ge'ez, one of the oldest alphabets still in use in the world. Since the 4th century, the nation had been a bastion of Orthodox Christianity, developing a distinct theological and artistic tradition entirely separate from Rome or Constantinople. Its political structure was built upon a continuous royal lineage that traced its origins to the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This wasn't just a kingdom, it was an empire with a deep sense of history, faith, and destiny. The fuse for the conflict was lit 7 years earlier, in 1889, through a classic act of colonial subterfuge. Italy and Ethiopia's Emperor, Menelik II, signed the Treaty of Wuchale. The treaty was intended to formalize diplomatic and commercial ties. However, it contained a fatal discrepancy. The Amharic version, which Menelik read and signed, stated that Ethiopia could use the Italian government to conduct its foreign affairs if it so chose. It was a friendly, optional arrangement. The Italian version, however, used a word that translated to must. This subtle but critical difference turned Article 17 into a declaration of protectorate status, effectively stripping Ethiopia of its sovereignty and making it a vassal of Italy. For a year, the deception held. But in 1890, when Menelik II began to engage with other European powers, he discovered the treachery. He learned that Italy had informed all of Europe that Ethiopia was now its protectorate. The emperor was enraged. Menelik, a shrewd and visionary leader, had spent years modernizing his army and consolidating his power over Ethiopia's powerful regional lords. He was not a man to be tricked or subjugated, publicly and unequivocally rejected the Italian interpretation of the treaty. In a letter to the European powers, he declared Ethiopia's full and indivisible independence, writing, "Ethiopia has need of no one. She stretches out her hands unto God." The diplomatic path had failed. War was now inevitable. In late 1895, Italy launched its invasion. General Oreste Baratieri, confident in his superior weaponry and the supposed indiscipline of African armies, marched his forces into the northern Ethiopian province of Tigray. The Italians initially secured a few minor victories, which only served to inflate their arrogance. Baratieri believed the Ethiopians would be easily scattered. What he did not account for was the unifying power of Emperor Menelik II and the formidable spirit of his people. Faced with a foreign invasion, Menelik issued a mobilization proclamation that resonated through every valley and mountaintop of his empire. He called upon all Ethiopians, the Shon, the Tigrayan, the Amhara, the Oromo, to put aside their regional rivalries and unite under one banner to defend their ancient land. The response was overwhelming. From every corner of the empire, regional leaders or raizes rallied their personal armies and marched to join the emperor's forces. In a matter of months, Menelik had assembled a massive, unified army of around 100,000 soldiers. This was not a disorganized militia, it was a determined and patriotic force. armed with a surprising number of modern rifles painstakingly acquired over the years from French and Russian traders. Crucial to this monumental effort was Empress Taytu Betul, Menelik's brilliant and fiercely anti-colonial wife, a formidable political strategist in her own right. She had been suspicious of the Italians from the very beginning and had urged Menelik to reject the treaty. The Italian forces, numbering around 17,000, were a mix of Italian soldiers and Eritrean auxiliaries, known as Askari. They were well equipped with modern artillery and machine guns. However, they were operating deep in hostile territory, plagued by poor intelligence, dwindling supplies, and a commander who drastically underestimated his opponent. By late February 1896, Baratieri's army was camped near the town of Adwa. Its supply lines stretched perilously thin. Back in Rome, the Italian government was growing impatient, and Prime Minister Crispi sent a scathing telegram to Baratieri, goading him to act. This is a military crisis, not a war. Stung by the insult and pressured to produce a decisive victory, Baratieri made a fatal decision. On the night of February 29th, he ordered his army to advance under the cover of darkness in a complex three-pronged attack. His plan was to surprise and outflank the Ethiopian camp. But the plan was a disaster from the start. His maps were inaccurate, the terrain was treacherous and unforgiving, and communication between the three advancing columns broke down almost immediately. The brigades got lost, stumbled into each other, and fell into disarray in the dark, rugged mountains. As the sun rose on the morning of March 1, 1896, Ethiopian scouts reported the confused Italian movements to Emperor Menelik. The Ethiopians, camped in a position of strength, had been observing a religious fast. Now, they prepared for battle. As the Italian columns struggled into position, they found themselves not in a flanking position, but isolated, exposed, and facing the full might of the Ethiopian army. The battle began. The Ethiopian forces, with Emperor Menelik and Empress Taytu near the front lines, crashed down upon the disjointed Italian brigades. The sheer number of Ethiopian soldiers was overwhelming. But it was their courage and tactical discipline that won the day. They charged with ferocity, their traditional shouts of Ibelgum, Ibelgum, reap, reap, striking terror into the hearts of the Italian soldiers. The fighting was brutal and often hand-to-hand. Ethiopian artillery, positioned on high ground, rained fire down on the Italians, while waves of infantry relentlessly assaulted their positions. One by one, the Italian brigades were surrounded and annihilated. By midday, the battle was over. The modern, well-equipped Italian army had been utterly destroyed. The scale of the defeat was staggering. Out of a force of 17,000, approximately 7,000 Italian troops were killed. 1,500 were wounded, and a further 3,000 were captured. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats ever suffered by a European colonial power in Africa. The Ethiopian victory was total and undeniable. News of the Battle of Adwa sent shockwaves across the world. In Italy, the government collapsed, and riots broke out in major cities. The dream of an East African empire had been shattered in a single day. Humbled and defeated, Italy was forced to the negotiating table. They signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, which unequivocally annulled the Treaty of Wuchale and formally recognized the absolute independence of Ethiopia. The nation that Italy had tried to trick into servitude was now recognized as its equal. For Europe, Adwa was a stunning and deeply unsettling event. It shattered the myth of European invincibility and proved that an African army, when well led and united, could decisively defeat a modern European one. But for people of African descent around the globe, the victory was something more. It was a beacon of hope and a source of immense pride. The news spread through Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, inspiring early anti-colonial movements and fueling a new sense of black consciousness. The green, yellow, and red of the Ethiopian flag became a potent symbol of African freedom and resistance. Later adopted by many nations as they gained their own independence, the victory at Adwa became a foundational story for Pan-Africanism. Of course, the struggle was not entirely over. In 1935, a vengeful Benito Mussolini, seeking to avenge the shame of Adwa and build his new Roman Empire, invaded Ethiopia once more. This time, the Italians came with overwhelming force, deploying tanks, modern aircraft, and banned chemical weapons like mustard gas. The capital Addis Ababa was captured in 1936, and Ethiopia endured a brutal 5-year occupation. But even then, it was never formally colonized. The Ethiopian government never surrendered, and a fierce resistance movement fought continuously in the countryside until the country was finally liberated. With British help in 1941, because of the heroism and foresight of leaders like Menelik II and Taytu Betul, and the unbreakable spirit of its people at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia holds a unique place in history. It remains the only African nation to have successfully and definitively resisted European colonization during the Scramble for Africa. Powerful and enduring testament that African strength and resistance were not just possible, but triumphant. Ethiopia defeated Italy in 1896 and became the only African nation to resist colonization. The Battle of Adwa wasn't just a military victory, it was a declaration of African strength that echoed across the world. If you want more stories of African resistance and power, hit subscribe, and new videos 3 times a week. Next, another untold story that changed history.